A lot of times I'll talk about a pretend, polite, and parallel marriage, which is a functional marriage,
Uh-huh.
versus an honest, intimate, and collaborative marriage. And a lot of times when I'll talk about it that way to clients, and I'll be like, which one, what do you think you want? And they're like, oh, of course I want honest, intimate, and collaborative, right? They don't
Right.
want pretend, polite, and parallel. But then when we talk about it, there's a price to be paid on both sides.
Welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. I'm your host, Dan Purcell, a Christian marriage and intimacy expert and coach. I'm on a mission to help couples have the best sex and most emotionally intimate marriages possible. Our episodes cover topics you've always wondered about and are packed with practical advice designed to help you take your marriage to the next level. Intimate relationships are a breeding ground for growth and development because they're really hard work to make great, but it's definitely a work worth doing. In my own experience, as well as working with other couples, there's a pattern I see of entanglement, and that's when you and your spouse are emotionally wrapped up in each other, like a tangled ball of yarn, not able to see which end is which. Then there are other couples that distance themselves emotionally from their spouse. In the world today, there seems to be an overemphasis on me culture, which leads to toxic individualism, and that's not healthy for relationships either. So I'm so happy to talk about these things with my guest today, Aimée Gianni. She's a friend of mine as well as a marriage and family therapist. She's an expert on these topics. She is wise, very experienced, and she's even spoken at a couple of my marriage retreats in the past as a guest speaker. In our conversation today, you'll get to hear about what's the difference between a functional marriage and an intimate marriage, and how you can tell which one you have. What's entanglement, and how do you know that you're entangled, and how do you get yourself out of its traps? And how do roles we've inherited play a role in our marriage dynamic, and what steps you can take to choose a better path in your relationship. And you'll also get to hear Amy's black belt sex tip too. Now, I'm really excited to tell you, we've just announced our next in-person marriage retreat, and I want to make sure you're invited. Our retreats are for married couples that are in otherwise good marriages but wish things were better intimately. Our retreats are rewarding because they challenge you to think and help you see patterns that you often fall into that keep you stuck, so that you can get yourself out of it. They're also super romantic and fun, and we laugh a lot. And of course, we talk a lot about intimacy and sex and marriage and how to make it better. The next retreat is October 26th through 29 in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It's limited to just 20 couples, and we will sell out. So if you're interested, don't delay. You'll get more details on my website at getyourmarriageon.com. Click on retreats, then DFW retreat. Aimée Gianni, what an honor to have you on the Get Your Marriage On podcast today. How are you?
Good. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
You have a really unique background. You're a licensed marriage and family therapist,
Yes.
as well as a marriage coach. So I want to know what got you interested in becoming a marriage therapist in the first place?
Yes. I have just always been interested in relationships ever since I was a kid. I was always watching people. I was watching, people in their marriages or even just friendships and relational dynamics. I've just always been interested in it. And I remember actually one time used to spend summers with my dad, and I was with him and we were walking on the beach. And I don't know, he loved relationships too. And we were talking about stuff. And he was like, "You should be a therapist." And I was like, "Oh, I think I want to be a therapist, actually." Anyway,
Uh-huh.
and then I
Uh-huh.
kind of like let that go. And then when I got to college, I actually started out as a business major, but then I
Uh-huh.
ended up switching my major to psychology and then eventually did a master's in marriage and family therapy because I've just always loved relationships. And I love people. I love intimacy. Like I love having personal, close connections with people. So,
That
yeah.
is so good. So what's the difference then between marriage coaching and marriage therapy?
Generally speaking, when people ask, like, what's the difference between therapy and coaching? I say there are very few differences. There's a lot of overlap. Technically, therapists have to be licensed, and coaching, of course, there's no regulation for that. But what you actually do, I would say, as a coach, I don't diagnose. Therapists, of course, can diagnose.
Mhm.
And if there's some trauma that has not been dealt with, I think that always needs to be handled by a therapist rather than a coach. A coach can deal with like if somebody's had trauma and they've dealt with it with a therapist,
Uh-huh.
then they can absolutely have coaching on whatever's going on in their life. But that's something that I always watch for. Yeah.
That's good. And I like how you told me before we recorded, you really want to work with couples that, have something, things are good, but they just want to really take things better. And
Yes,
that's what our podcast is about too.
yes,
So I want to talk today about the difference between a functional marriage and an intimate marriage. First of all, can you define those two terms?
yes, absolutely. So I think of a functional marriage as kind of a parallel marriage, or people are in a really good functional flow. Like they get along okay, right? And they have this day-to-day routine, and he does this and she does that, and the kids always get picked up and the bills get paid, and stuff happens for the most part. So it's very functional. And it's good. It's not great, but it's good and it's okay, right? Whereas an intimate marriage is much more, I mean, just that. It's intimate. There's a closeness. So they still have the functional part,
Hmm.
um, but they just feel closer to each other. There's more honesty. A lot of times I'll talk about a pretend, polite, and parallel marriage, which is a functional marriage,
Uh-huh.
versus an honest, intimate, and collaborative marriage. And a lot of times when I'll talk about it that way to clients, and I'll be like, which one, what do you think you want? And they're like, oh, of course I want honest, intimate, and collaborative, right? They don't
Right.
want pretend, polite, and parallel. But then when we talk about it, there's a price to be paid on both sides, but an honest, intimate, and collaborative marriage requires honesty, vulnerability, which is scary, and it's really
Right.
messy, right? An intimate marriage sounds beautiful, but, it's messy and it's not always comfortable, whereas pretend, polite, and parallel, you're kind of able to stay, on the surface, and nothing gets too heated, but nothing also really gets resolved, or there's really not that closeness.
Right. Yes. Um, what you're saying reminds me, my wife was out of town last weekend and anticipating her return. I worked hard to get the house ready, everything. I was just really tired. She comes home around 10 o'clock at night. And in the back of my mind, so I like when she comes home, she's gonna wanna have sex. And
Mhm.
I have this fear of like, I'm so tired. I am not in the mood. What if I can't,
Mhm.
function or anything in that?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to manage her, like, but I don't want to disappoint her. So maybe I need to put out, and then all of a sudden I'm no longer my authentic self. I'm really into like a pretend self in that instance.
Yes.
And a pretend self can't connect genuinely with another person
Right.
because I'm in my pretend persona.
Yeah.
And but it kind of creates a breeding ground. It kind of keeps reinforcing that. And we end up having a very parallel homecoming.
Yes. Yes. Right.
Uh,
Yeah, rather than an intimate connectment, because you could have an intimate connected homecoming that didn't involve sex, right?
yes, but it would require me to be vulnerable and say, "I'm
Yeah.
sorry to disappoint you,"
Yeah. Right.
right? And I didn't wanna disappoint her.
Right.
But that was the cost
Yes.
that I wasn't willing to pay.
Right. Yeah. So there's a cost on both sides, right? Like there's the cost of the honest, intimate, and collaborative. The cost on the other side is that you end up kind of creating almost a pretend relationship, right?
Mhm.
Or, and also like over time, like if you were to do that again and again and again, you're going to have resentments building up on one side or the other or both, right?
Right, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that resentment is a killer
Killer.
for
Yep.
creating an intimate marriage too.
Yes. Yeah.
In what ways do we kind of create or co-create this parallel marriage with our spouse? A lot of those I coach, they're in a situation where they feel like they're in a parallel relationship and they hate it. What are the
Yeah.
telltale signs of a parallel, low honesty marriage, like what you
Yeah.
described?
Yeah. So people pleasing
Mhm.
definitely is
Uh-huh.
one. Because when you're people pleasing, right, and I guess to an extreme, that's self-sacrificing. I think self-sacrificing is a big thing. When people are doing that, they think that it's healthy, like, well, but you're supposed to sacrifice for other people and for those that you love, right? Which there is some truth in that. Marriage does involve sacrifice, but that's different from self-sacrificing.
And by self-sabotage, do you mean like self-abnegation? Like, I am not important. I don't matter. It's
Yes,
it's that kind of a
right.
sacrifice. Uh-huh.
Exactly. It's setting aside like whatever your wants and needs and desires are and always putting everybody else ahead of you.
Mhm.
Whereas in an intimate relationship, you want to be able to love and care for yourself and your spouse at the same time. It doesn't have to be an either or, right? So self sacrificing is when you get into either or and it's I always do what they want because they want it and put my needs aside, right? And that's not good for either partner.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And we kind of hear a lot of that in our cultural messages, right? Like,
Yes.
take care of your spouse, make her needs just as much or more important than yours. And that's the formula for creating a happy marriage.
Yes.
And in some ways, that advice is good or probably breaks down in other ways too. Can you
Yeah.
talk more on that?
Yeah. I think anything taken to an extreme gets us in trouble, right?
Hmm.
And
Right.
so, do we want to be aware of our partner's needs? And do we want to be attentive to them? And do we want to help them and love them and give to them in the way that they want to receive love? Absolutely.
Hmm.
So, I think that's where the advice is helpful, right? But
Uh-huh.
taken to an extreme of I don't matter and I just need to always put them ahead of me. And, like we were kind of like we were just talking about, that's taken to an extreme and that's not healthy.
And then we wonder why we're not happy because it's
Yeah.
supposed to be the formula for a happy marriage.
Right. This is what's supposed to make me so happy. Why am I so miserable? Right.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, how about the other extreme in that where what I want is supreme
Yeah.
to the detriment of yours? Because I think some people can interpret that message that, oh, wait, I'm not supposed to sacrifice for my spouse. I'm supposed to
Mhm.
put the attention on me. What does that look like?
Yeah, so then that's just total selfishness, right? And I think about this culture of I or me as opposed to we. And I think
Mm.
our culture and society has placed so much movement towards the individual, like, yes, I take care of me, you take care of you, and a relationship is just kinda how we come together and have fun once in a while, right? But, I love that Terry Real talks
Mhm.
so much about thinking relationally, and what does it mean to think relationally? And again, that's like, what's in the best interest of the relationship? And when you're thinking that way, you're gonna be doing what's best for me and you at the same time, right? As opposed to choosing. So,
Yeah.
I just love that concept of putting the we over the me.
Good. I like that too. That's good. Tell me about entanglement and what does that look like in marriages?
Yes. So you've probably heard me talk before about this continuum that I talk about, where one side, you're tangled up, you're all entangled. And then the other side is this toxic individualism, which,
Which we've just been talking about now.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
exactly. And then what you really want is this healthy interdependence, which is in the middle. But the entanglement is where you are merged, right? We've kind of been talking about that too, right? That's just the word that I use for it, is being tangled, where you merge with somebody else, where maybe you're taking responsibility for your spouse's emotions and you're expecting them to take responsibility for your emotions, right? Like, he needs to make me happy. Why isn't he making me happy? And then thinking, and it's my job to make him happy. So I should be doing all these things in order to make him happy. So when you're tangled, you don't really know where you end and the other one begins. And sometimes
Hmm.
I like to do a visual example of a hug. If you think of two people hugging each other, you saw me
Uh-huh.
do this with Emily
Right. Yes. Uh-huh.
at your retreat, right? To give the example of you're hugging each other, but you're hanging on each other and kind of pushing and pulling. And I'm like, well, why are you're tipping me over? And she's like, well, but you tipped me over first, right? It's kind of this like very unstable hug. So from a distance, it might look like, oh, these two are so close and intimate because they're all wrapped up in each other, but it's very unhealthy, right? It's very unstable and it's not pleasant because you don't know if you're going to get knocked over,
Mhm.
right?
And one thing about that hug too is both people are off balance going into the
Yes.
hug, and you're relying on your partner to kind of keep
Hold
you
you
up.
up.
But the moment you shift your weight, they need to overcompensate too. So it's not a very stable structure.
Yeah, exactly. It's not. So that's like the best visual representation I can give of entanglement, what it
Mhm.
looks like. And then emotionally, it's all those things, we were talking about. And it's blame. There's a lot of blame
Uh-huh.
in an entangled relationship. Yeah. So it's the merging. It's also like not knowing who you are or what you want, the people pleasing, all of that.
Can you give me an example of entanglement that you see in couples, maybe those with religious background, perhaps?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I've worked with a lot of couples and even individuals where they have both been the same religion for many years, right? And been married in their church or their temple, made specific promises and covenants with each other. And then later down the road, one ends up leaving that religion or, taking a break from it, right? And it's really interesting because as I work with them, they'll talk about what it was like before the partner left. And s and so before the partner leaves the religion, there was entanglement because they wanted to leave sooner, but they felt like they shouldn't because they needed to stay for their spouse so that they could kind of live up to this, you know, picture that they created together, right? So the one spouse is trying to please the other by staying, but then when the spouse finally decides to leave, it exposes all sorts of other entanglement, right? Because then the spouse that's staying sometimes says, "Hey, well, why are you doing that? I thought we're in this together," right? So there's a lot of entanglement there. As
Yes.
opposed to if they're not entangled, right? The spouse who doesn't leave might be really upset or disappointed, but be okay with like, "Hey, but I want you to be in alignment with what feels good to you. So I'm disappointed that you're going, but it's okay. I still love you and I can still be invested and close to you." Right?
That requires more strength,
Yes.
more honesty.
Right.
I see it in my coaching too. Like a particular couple comes to mind where they have severe sexual desire differences.
Mhm.
And the one with more desire points to the lower desire as, "You're the problem. You need to get your act together. How come you're not interested in sex or whatever?" And the
Mhm.
lower desire spouse, same thing, points to the higher desire spouse as, "You're the problem. That's all you think about. Every single problem that we have in our marriage, it always comes down to this. Like, you're the
Yes.
one." Anyway, it's an easy place to hide when you're tangled
Right.
because you can hide behind what it is that you see wrong in your other spouse, and you're trying to get them to change so that
Mhm.
you feel better about yourself. It's really about using other people.
Yeah. Yeah. It's manipulation and it's hiding behind blame. Like you feel so justified, right?
Yes, uh-huh,
Yes.
right.
So justified because you're
Mhm.
like, "No, this isn't a me problem. This is a you problem."
Right, right,
And then it protects you from having to take a look in the mirror.
right, right. I see it also where, like, one spouse has used pornography or is using pornography, the other feels really betrayed by that.
Mhm.
It's so easy to use a lot of blame and hiding and really not make this a we problem or an us problem. That's exposed a lot too.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Tell me about gender roles. How do you see entanglement pop up in those situations?
Yeah. I think that that comes up when people have gender-based roles in their marriage that they didn't decide on intentionally, right? So following gender-based roles is absolutely no problem if you collaboratively come together and you're like, "How do we wanna run our life and our marriage?" Right? Like, "Okay, he's gonna go to work, she's gonna stay home, he's gonna take care of the yard, she's gonna do the dishes," right? Whatever.
Right.
Nothing wrong with it as long as they decide intentionally, but when people just fall into it out of expectation or because they think that that's how things are supposed to be, I think that is a breeding ground for entanglement and for problems. Yeah.
Gotcha. Good, good. Cool. That reminds me of a funny story. There's a newlywed, they've been married a week, and
Mhm.
it's their first full Saturday together. And they wake up and he tells his wife, "Hey, how about you go mow the lawn?" And she gets upset, like, "Mow the lawn? No, that's a man's job." But turns out in his home growing up, the mom mowed the lawn. So we
Oh,
always
really?
thought, right.
Yeah.
And then she's like, "How about you go make breakfast?" And he's like, "No,
Mhm.
I'm not making breakfast." But turns out in her home growing up, the dad always made breakfast on Saturday. So
Yes,
isn't it funny
that's
how
so funny.
we inherit sometimes our gender roles isn't kind of what we expect them to be too. And we
Right.
kind of have this expectation that our spouse needs to be a certain way. But
Yes.
when you can talk about it and like you said, fully step in and choose it, it
Yeah.
makes a whole lot more sense.
And this is just kind of a stupid story about me, but I remember when I very first got married and, we'd just been married like a month or something, and then my whole extended family went on this vacation, and I remember my mom said something about taking out the garbage. Okay, this is so embarrassing because I was like 21 years old, right?
All right. Uh-huh.
I'm like, "I just got married. I don't take out the garbage anymore. He does."
uh-huh.
And I remember my mom, she was like, "Really?" She just kinda rolled her eyes, and she turned to her husband, and she's like, "Oh, okay, she doesn't take out the garbage anymore."
That's awesome.
Since then, I've taken out the garbage a million times.
Good. Oftentimes, when you're really tangled, you don't see that you're tangled because you're in it. It's like a fish in water, like you don't
Yes.
realize it. How can people gain more awareness of their entanglements and then move towards becoming less entangled and more towards healthy interdependence?
Yeah. So the first step is always self-awareness, and but you just said like, well, how do they get self-awareness, right?
Right.
And I'm sure this is a question that you've talked about on your podcast before, but I think one of the best places to start is that, okay, what's it like to be in relationship with me? That's a really good
Mm.
place to gain awareness,
Hmm.
right? Because we're always looking from our perspective out to our spouse,
Right.
and we feel like we have such a great view of that, but rarely do we turn it back on us. And so starting with that, like, what is it like to be in a relationship with me? Would I want to be in a relationship with me?
Hmm.
I think that brings up a lot. And then also asking your spouse, like I would start first with just you taking a look at you, but then I think asking your spouse, what is it like to be in relationship with me? What's amazing about it and what's difficult about it? And being open to hear from them because that's where that honesty comes in. And there may be things that you don't want to hear, but it's going to open your eyes to so many things.
Yes, that's great. Sometimes we really don't want to hear what our spouses say. We
Right.
just want to hear what we want them to say.
Right.
Like, I have a friend, she went and got a haircut. She
Hmm.
came home and asked her husband, "So, do you like my haircut? It's a different hairstyle."
Hmm.
And he said, "Well, it's a haircut." And she
Hmm.
didn't want him to say that. She wanted him to say, "This is so lovely and wonderful. You look great in it." That's what she was
Yes.
really wanting him to say. She
Right.
really wasn't interested in what he had to say. We
Yeah.
often do that too. That
All the
keeps us
time.
stuck, doesn't we? Don't we?
Yeah, like, we want our spouse to just validate the good things in us, right? Or validate our opinions. We just wanna hear what we wanna hear. But if we really want an intimate marriage, we have to be willing to hear truth, and then hopefully you're both speaking truth kindly. I always say, like, truth spoken kindly is always the way forward, even if it's not something you wanna hear. Truth spoken negatively or meanly is not going to help. Um, but anyway, yeah.
Right.
It's being willing to take a look at and then be honest with yourself when you get that feedback, even if you're resistant to it at first, because I've gotten feedback like that before and been like, "Ah," and immediately I wanna defend, but if I can, like, take a minute to breathe and be like, "Okay, I'm gonna go away with this by myself, and I'm gonna think about it, like, where is he right? How is he right about me?" Um it helps then I'm able to see it, but sometimes I can't do it in the moment in the discussion because there's too much emotion or I'm feeling too defensive. So I really need to kind of take it into a corner by myself, calm down, and then I can take an honest look at it. And it always opens up to something. And it doesn't mean that every single thing the other person said is true about you or that you have to agree with it, but there's just so much information in there if you're willing to take a look at it.
Yes, that's good. That's good. Any other steps?
Yeah, I think you also once you start with yourself, then you also wanna take a look at your narrative, like, what do you tell yourself? What's the story you tell yourself about your relationship? Because the way that you think about your relationship determines the way that you experience it.
Mm,
And so
mhm.
I think sometimes untangling involves just taking an honest look at the story and recognizing that your story isn't necessarily factual, right?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and because it's a story, you can edit it,
Yes,
or
exactly.
rewrite it.
Mhm. And so we usually go around with these stories in our head that we just think are facts. And so we interact with our relationship in a certain way because we have this narrative going on. And the more that we can identify that narrative, I think that helps us untangle because then we can start to identify the parts of the story that keep us tangled.
Yes.
Another thing I would say is, and I know we've talked about this, but I just want to highlight it, it's knowing who you are and what you want and being willing to ask for it because that's foundational for any good relationship. It's loving yourself as you are, and if people can't quite get to loving themselves, it's accepting yourself as you are and giving yourself permission to want what you want.
That's really good.
Yeah.
So we're talking about defining ourselves, and, like, that self-definition is really important. Who do I want to be in this relationship? What kind of a man or woman do I wanna be? What kind of a husband or wife do I wanna be? What kind of a sexual person do I wanna be, for example, in the context of a sexual relationship, right? Like,
Right?
really getting clear within yourself really helps with that. Tell me about the power of choice in the context of self-definition.
Yes. Choice is everything because without it, when we're not taking ownership for our choices and choosing intentionally, it's really easy to fall into victimhood or to be a martyr, right? And I'll hear this, people are almost coming from a place of obligation, like, "Well, I'm married and my marriage is terrible, but I guess I just have to stay married." Um, and they're really victim-y about it,
Right. They feel
right?
stuck,
Yeah, they
but
feel
but they're putting themselves in the prison. Uh-huh.
yes,
But the doors are
exactly.
open. They can leave
Right,
whenever.
they can leave, yes,
Uh-huh.
but they're putting themselves and so the way out of victimhood and to empowerment is choice every single
Ah,
time, right?
right. Mhm.
So if somebody's really stuck in that, I'll say, "Okay, let you have so many choices, you actually aren't stuck." It feels that way, I totally get that it feels that way, but let's look at what choices you do have, and what are you choosing? Because if you're approaching your relationship from a place of victimhood or martyrdom, where, it's obligation and, I mean, we could talk about obligation sex, right? Like, obligation shows up all over in relationships, so taking a look at where do you feel obligated or stuck? And then inviting yourself to see choices. What options are there? And who do you want to be? Like you were saying, who do I want to be in this relationship? How do I want to show up? And then it's choosing your spouse every single day. We talk about the importance. I mean, you choose who you're going to marry when you marry them, but then it's choosing them again and again and again and again.
Yeah, it's always choosing.
Mhm.
Sometimes you don't have great options. Sometimes
Mhm.
your choices are all crappy choices,
Right. Yes.
and you have to choose among your crappy choices, the least
Right.
crappy one you're willing to live with, considering your circumstances.
Yeah.
But it's that I still have a choice.
Choice, yeah. And that's usually when we tell ourselves, I don't have any choice. I have no options." What we're really saying is, "I don't like any of my options." Right?
Right, right.
Yeah. But there's always you always have choice.
Mhm.
Always. Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so, let's say you're a couple, you're working hard at becoming less entangled, and the
Mhm.
process for that, which we've talked about, among other things, is really about showing up more honestly and
Mhm.
authentically. There's a price to pay for that,
Mhm.
on both sides, but you don't wanna live a parallel marriage anymore, you wanna be an intimate marriage.
Yeah.
It's more real. Part of that is that self-definition piece and, like, choosing, "This is who I want to be in it."
Mhm.
Once you get to that point, things are good. What are your black belt sex tips?
Ooh.
What are your ideas to take sex from where it is to that next level?
I love it. I've never quite heard that term before, so I like it. Um I'm sure there's all sorts of, like, practical tips out there, but I think emotionally speaking, the more that you're willing to see your partner, to know what they like, care enough to find out what do they like, how do they want to be loved sexually, and then again, it's choice, right? It's choosing to love them that way because you wanna be close to them, because you care about them. I think that makes such a difference in a sexual relationship, and then also just, keeping the door open for possibility, right? Having a little bit of mystery or excitement or newness, the playfulness,
Uh-huh.
adventurous, being open for that, right? And always being willing to go into it together. Like I think of sex as like an adult playground where it's like you're side by side and it's like, "Hey, do you want to go in there? Do you want to go like on the swing? Like you want to go play? Let's
Uh-huh.
go." Get excited. You're like, "Yes, let's go." Right? We're up for the adventure together, whatever that is.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. So get a swing. That's what I'm hearing
Yeah,
from
there we
you.
go. Get a and a slide.
Very good. Where
Yeah,
can people go to find out more about what you do, teach, offer, coach, and things
yeah.
like that?
So you can go to my website, it's amygianni.com, and Amy's AIMEE. And then you can also follow me on Instagram where I post several times a week. It's, Amy Gianni MS. And I do send out weekly love notes on Tuesday with practical tips for creating an intimate marriage. And, you can sign up for my love notes, either in my bio on Instagram or on my website.
Great. I sign up for your love notes. They're fantastic.
Awesome. Thank you. So
All
glad.
right. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you're interested in accelerating growth in your marriage, either sexually, emotionally, or spiritually, I want to invite you to work with me in my affordable coaching program called Next Level. More information about Next Level and my fun and sexy apps for couples are available at getyourmarriageon.com. Please also don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss a single episode. And be sure to tell your married friends. I promise, they will thank you for life. Now go get your marriage on.